Hello, Kristian Cantens.
Hi,
How are you doing?
I am doing good. I'm here in Texas and it's nice and sunny out finally. There was a bit of snow last week, but now it's nice and warm. How are you doing?
Interesting, thanks. Everything's fine. So, if you agree, I say the introduction and later we start talking about our main topic.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So, before everything, I want to say hello to all 3danet cultural institution audiences. As you know, nowadays feeding domesticated animals, especially the homeless one, is very pandemic and extensive among Iranian. I'm Sara Nickandish, and our today's guest is Kristian Cantens, who's graduated from Texas University and has a lot of scientific researches about environmental and animal ethics. So we decided to talk about these topics with him. Kristian, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Kristian Cantens. I am a graduate student here at Texas A&M, right at the heart of Texas. I'm almost completed with my PhD, and I'm a philosopher by training, but my specialties include environmental ethics and specifically animal ethics. And I have been doing research recently on specifically wild animals and our moral obligations towards wild animals, the appropriate kinds of policies that we should enact in regards to them and things like that. But our relationship to domesticated animals is also one of my interest areas. And
So,
thank you so much for having me here. I'm like, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm very grateful to be invited.
thanks for accepting our invitation.
Yeah.
So I want to start with the first question. In our country, Iran, the number of homeless cats and dogs is increasing every day, and they cause many issues and diseases for humans, and they also suffer from pain. And in some cases, they are the reason of the endangered animals' death. What should we do to control this overpopulation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. Like, it's also an issue here in the United States. In the United States, I think there are a total of 2 to 4 million animals a year that are that can, like, nobody can find homes for them and are euthanized, actually. And the animals that do live as strays, as what we call feral animals, they do cause a lot of problems, like you mentioned. Like, they sometimes carry diseases, and they are a threat to a lot of like native species, including a lot of endangered species, and that's specifically a problem with cats, that kill like an obscene amount of birds. So that's a huge issue. And like you said, these are animals that were bred to be domesticated. They were bred to live with it among us in our homes, preferably. So when they are just like out in the wild, they usually are not well equipped to live the best kind of life, the best life that they could possibly live. So yeah, it does present a host of different problems. Um, and one of the main solutions that people have so far been implementing is just castrating them. So spaying and neutering, that seems to be like the first line of defense. But for me, I think that there's an even more significant problem that needs to be addressed before we get to the spaying and neutering. I think that the reason that there are so many animals without homes that are living as strays is because we've we continue to breed them for the purpose of selling them to people, and I think that that's like a really problematic practice, for a whole bunch of different reasons. So like these animals keep coming into existence even though there are a lot already that have no homes to go to. So this population just keeps expanding year after year, and and then there are other issues with breeding animals to be sold, which is that the animals that are the breeding animals, the ones that are producing these offspring to be sold in stores, they also live really horrible lives. Like, they're kept in captivity. Many of their basic needs are not met. So I think that the first way of addressing this problem is just by stopping the sale of domesticated animals, and I think that's I think the source of the problem. So if you get rid of that, I think you're going to go a long ways to alleviating this issue. but then I think that spaying and neutering is also a good way of preventing this. Um, so those two, I think would those two options I think would go a long ways to curbing the problem.
So now we have a big question here. Would you please explain about wild, domesticated, and liminal animals, and how can we distinguish them from each other, and do they have a specific division? And also, which group do cats and dogs belong to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, so yeah, we can. There are different kinds of animals. So like this problem obviously doesn't come up when we consider wild animals. Like wild animals are meant to be out in the wild, and that's perfectly fine. They've adapted to live in that kind of ecosystem, and so they don't really pose the same kinds of problems. And then so our relationship to wild animals is pretty simple. We should just leave them alone and let them do their own thing. We shouldn't interfere in their lives, and we should let them just go about how they would go about normally without our intervention.
Just
Um,
be independent to us.
yeah, and so that would be the case with wild animals. So that's how they evolved to live their own lives. And then we have domesticated animals on the other hand, and these animals for thousands of years have been selectively bred to live lives among us. So they're bred to be dependent on us, and if we don't provide for them, then they're gonna be exposed to a whole bunch of harms that wouldn't be the case with wild animals. So so because of that, because we've bred them to be dependent on us, I think that we have special kinds of obligations towards them. Um, because they can't just go off and live their own lives the way that wild animals can. It might be argued that we have obligations to take care of them and meet some of their basic needs. But then this sort of division between wild and domesticated, it doesn't work for all types of animals. There are some animals that kind of fall in between, so they're not domesticated the way that cats and dogs are. We haven't actually bred them and specifically created certain breeds that suit our preferences in the way that we have with domesticated animals. But at the same time, they live among us. And so we can call these liminal animals, and the word liminal means in between. So they're neither wild nor domesticated. And so examples of these are like raccoons. And I'm not sure how many of the same animals you guys have in Iran, but here we have like raccoons and a lot of like the birds that live in our cities, like pigeons and crows. We can also think of coyotes. And so these animals are just used to living within human civilization, but we haven't like interfered in their reproduction to the extent of like modifying them to suit our own preferences. So that's an interesting category, and I think a lot of interesting there are a lot of interesting dilemmas that kind of arise when we consider this class of animals. So we don't have the same obligations to them as we do with domesticated animals because we haven't made them dependent on us. So they're not by nature reliant on us to meet their basic needs. But at the same time, a lot of our actions do impact them, and so we have to be really careful about what we do and the kinds of projects that we engage in, the kind of development that we undertake, because these actions could have significant impacts on their lives. So these are animals that we just have to be aware of because they do live among us, and then our actions and the way that we lead our lives will have impacts on their own well-being. So I think it's helpful to divide animals into these three categories. Yeah.
So, the common opinion among our specialists and the government is to castrate such animals and construct an ambush or a shelter at the same time. They also think that the disease carriers should be killed. Do you find this method moral or ethical?
So we can start with castration, like spaying and neutering. I think that in most cases it's probably okay because so think of like feral cats that are just they just keep reproducing, but because they're living in an environment that they're not really suited to. They're meant to be in our homes, like that's how they were bred. but when they're outside and trying to scavenge on their own, that's not really the lives that they're supposed to be leading. So they're subjected to a lot of harms that a cat that lives indoors wouldn't be. So they might not find enough food. So a lot of these animals are like dying of starvation. And so they can be subject to all these different harms. They can be run over by cars. And so that's an issue. And I think that because they are domesticated animals, because we've bred them to be dependent on us, we should be concerned about their well-being. It's our responsibility to make sure that they're living okay lives. So I think that in this case, spaying and neutering them to prevent future offspring is actually justifiable, because by limiting the population of these animals, you're preventing future suffering. So in that case, it's justifiable. But I think that it's problematic when we just adopt this policy of spay and neuter every single domesticated animal.
Mhm.
So specifically, so think of like animals that are living in our own homes, and they really don't have any chances. We're not giving them any chances to reproduce on their own because they're not really interacting with other cats or other dogs. In that case, is like you might argue that spaying and neutering is depriving these animals of something, or it's violating maybe some of their rights. They might have like the right to bodily autonomy. We're making a decision over their body that they haven't consented to. And some people might argue that you're depriving them
Being
of
parent
choices.
or
Sorry, say.
being parent or something like that.
Yeah, you could say that that's an important part. That could be an important part of an animal's life, like the ability to choose to reproduce and to have offspring. That can bring a lot of pleasure. For the mother to raise offspring, that might be something that's fulfilling. They might actually enjoy engaging in sex. So, like, taking these opportunities away from them, it's not. I don't think it's morally neutral. I think it's a little bit bad. So we shouldn't always take the position. We shouldn't take the position that we should always spay and neuter animals. We should only do so when it's justified, because it would prevent a lot of future suffering. So in the case of overpopulation of cats that are feral, that are living out in the wild, I think that's justifiable. And especially given the fact that with the case of cats, they are killing tons of birds. So that's another issue that we should take into account.
Issue.
Like, that's bad, and we're responsible for that because we've brought these animals into existence. So we're responsible to the harms that these cats are inflicting on the birds. So it gets tricky, but yeah, in those cases, I think spaying and neutering is the right decision.
So, on whom this answer depends? The government, specialized philosophers of ethics.
I mean, I think this is a decision that we have to make as a whole, and I think that there is a right answer. So yeah, it's a political question. Like, it's a political decision ultimately, but the politicians should be making the decision that's correct. And as far as what's I mean, anyone can come up with the correct answer. I don't think it's a matter of like we have to reserve the right of some people to say what's right and wrong. Like, this is something that we can discuss as the way that we are discussing, and so once we've come to a good answer, then the politicians should follow suit and enact certain policies that would address these issues in the right way.
So, as you mentioned before, we were talking a little bit about castrating and castration. So, there are two different reasoning about castrating. One of them is for, and the other one is against. So, the fans of this reasoning think that if we castrate animals, we can reduce pain and trouble of all the species. And the other reasoning is against it. Being a parent is an accomplishment, and with castrating, we deprive that animal from this perfection. So, due to the Iran situation, is castrating true? If yes, under which conditions?
Yeah. And so like as I mentioned, that I don't think that we should think of castration as something that's morally neutral. I think there's always going to be something a little bit bad about it, and how bad you consider castration depends on your ethical commitments. So someone who's more who believes in animal rights, for instance, they might argue that like animals have certain rights they can't be violated, and so they might be more inclined to say no castration because you're depriving them of autonomy. As you said, that you're depriving them of the ability to create their own families, to engage in behaviors that they might be inclined to engage in. Um, but but I think that even with the supporters of animal rights, like even usually they would even say that this is a necessary evil given how dire the situation is. So because these animals are suffering and because they're causing harm to others, humans as well as other animals like birds, that in this case that maybe violating rights is actually warranted. But I think that, as for my position, I think that the priority shouldn't be castration. The priority should be preventing animals from being sold in the first place, because then you stop you stop incentivizing the breeding of more and more animals, because overpopulation is the problem, and the reason there's an overpopulation problem is because people keep creating more and more animals to meet the demand of consumers. So I think that if someone wants a domesticated animal like as a pet, I think that's totally fine, but it should be a similar process as the one that we engage in when we adopt humans. I think that it should be more regulated. And there shouldn't be some breeder who like has animals in his basement and breeds them, for a living. I think that that's a form of exploitation, and I think that we should look very like disfavorably upon that. So yeah, I think the priority should just be like stop the commodification of domesticated animals. Like we shouldn't be able to buy and sell them. Like I think that's the big issue. And I think that would get at the root of the problem. And if we stop that, we wouldn't have the issue of overpopulation in the first place.
So I think in this case, your opinion is really similar to the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. Am I right?
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean that's a good insight, and I think that one way that like Aristotle and specifically the theory of virtue ethics, which he's associated with, can give us a lot of guidance in these situations. So Aristotle, for instance, so like this is one moral theory out of many moral theories. So like I've briefly kind of mentioned different approaches that we can take. We can take like a rights-based approach. We can say that there are certain things we cannot do to animals no matter what. So that's more of like a rights-based approach. And then there's a utilitarian approach, consequentialist, which means that right actions is dependent on the consequences. So it's not that there are certain actions that are right and certain actions that are wrong. It really just depends on what the consequences of our actions are. And then Aristotle was unique because he thought that it was a matter of a person's character. And so what the right thing is will depend on the context, and the good person will just act in the right way depending on the context. And so I think that virtue ethics could help us because it doesn't really give us like black and white answers. Your virtue ethicist will say, well, it depends. So I like that approach because I agree that like sometimes we shouldn't castrate animals, but sometimes like, I think it's justified because of the context, and we just have to sort of make sense of what's at stake given our present situation. So again, going back to the example of castrating domesticated animals that live with you in your home versus castrating domesticated animals that live out in the wild, I think when they live in your home and there's no chance of them continuing to reproduce, or if you want to allow them to reproduce but like in a controlled manner that's not dangerous or harmful to anyone, then I think castration probably isn't the best option. But then in the case of domesticated animals that are living out in the wild, I think in that case because there are so many harms that would go about that would come about as a result of allowing them to reproduce freely, I think that castration is probably the right thing. Um, and it's interesting because a lot of conservationists recently are applying the same approach, more of like a virtue ethics approach. So specifically in this field of conservation, there's this new movement that's called compassionate conservation. And so they're making decisions, conservation decisions, including, overpopulation of certain species. That's a big issue, all over the world. They're making these decisions not by appealing to certain rules that are just like, certain actions should never be taken. They're making decisions by saying, well, what would the compassionate person do in this situation? And so they consider like, individual animals in a compassionate way, versus thinking just in terms of like numbers. So that's always been like a very popular approach amongst conservationists. They just look at the big numbers. It's like, how do we maximize well-being for an entire ecosystem? And so a lot of, when you think in those terms, like, then you might justify just killing as many like animals as possible in order to save a certain ecosystem, which is something that they might propose for domesticated animals that are really populous. But a compassionate conservationist would be like, well, okay, let's just step back and try to like figure out like a middle way that doesn't harm too many animals, and but at the same time addresses these problems that are really pressing. Okay, so that's what I have.
So now we're in a good place, and I have a few questions about inanimate nature. Inanimate have profits, and how are these interests defined?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Yeah. So that's a question that would fall under the domain of environmental ethics more broadly. And there are different kinds of opinions that you could have. There are different ways of answering that question. You could say that, inanimate nature, so like ecosystems and mountains and rivers, they're important because they provide certain services. And you could think that they're just important instrumentally. They're important as a means to an end. So you could say, for instance, that they're important because they're good for humans in some way. So like the fact that there are mountains and rivers allows us to have this continuous water supply. The fact that there's fertile soil is good because we can grow our crops. So that's like the approach that I think most people would take. It's like, the environment, it's important because it helps humans. But you can also take like a more extreme approach and say that like, environments in themselves, inanimate aspects of the environment have value as well. So there's one way of making that case is that by saying that a lot of people say that, for instance, diversity is important. So when we're determining how to value an ecosystem, if the ecosystem is more diverse, if there are more kinds of living organisms there, that's better. And then, inanimate aspects of nature are important because they might encourage more diversity. But you can go even further than that. You could say that it's not just about the diversity of an ecosystem, that like that rocks too are important and have value. That's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder to make that case because you have to answer the question. It's like, well, because if you give value to rocks and rivers and mountains and stuff like that, then what's to prevent you from going further and saying, well, it's like, well, like phones, like they also have moral value, and like human artifacts, like a bomb. Does a bomb have like moral value? Should we like like a I don't know, like a knife? So you can, if you start assigning moral value to like to rocks and streams and rivers and saying that they're valuable in and of themselves, then you start running into problems, because then it's like, well, where do you draw the line? Does everything matter morally? So I personally wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't say that mountains or phones or knives have moral value in and of themselves. Um, personally, like I, as far as like the environment goes, I kind of draw the line with sentient creatures. Um, so I think that like even trees and plants and grasses and stuff like that, I think that they're only valuable insofar as they are good for they provide an environment for sentient creatures that can feel pain and pleasure. So that's where I draw the line, so but I wouldn't, as most people would, I wouldn't say that the environment is good only because it's good for humans. I wouldn't go that far. I think that that's a very like a very narrow-minded perspective to take.
Being
So we should expand.
selfish,
Huh? Sorry,
I
say again.
said being a bit selfish, just to want nature just as a meat
Yeah.
of need for human.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely, yeah, selfish. And like the word that we use in environmental ethics is anthropocentric. So centered, anthropos from the Greek for human, so centered on the human. Um, and I think that that's a huge problem today, that like people just like can't stop taking that assumption that only humans matter. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've gotten ourselves into so many environmental problems. Like we just don't really think that nature in and of itself is valuable. We just like, it starts with the human and it ends with the human, and that's it. So I think that that's a very problematic position to take, and I very much disagree with it.
So the next question is a bit challenging, but I think I can guess your answer before. The question is human life morally superior to animals?
I would I would say no. And because again, you have to ask yourself, it's like, well, what is it in virtue of what trait or characteristic are we to say that anything at all matters morally? So you have to really try to answer that question and try to point at what exactly it is that gives someone or something moral value. And so for me, I think that the threshold that makes most sense is the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. So if an animal feels pleasure and pain, I think that we should take them into consideration, because things can go badly for them and things can go well for them. So they really have an opinion as to like how as to how things turn out for them. And you can't say the same thing about rocks. Like a rock doesn't really care how you treat it. You can kick a rock, and the rock, you can't say it's like, well, no, that's bad for the rock. The rock is going to be upset about that. It's like that doesn't make any sense. Whereas if you said it's like, don't kick that dog, you can explain. It's like, well, the dog doesn't like to be kicked, so it makes sense, but then the people who try to draw a distinction between humans and animals, I think that when you try to draw that distinction, you start getting into a lot of problems, because what really distinguishes us? How are we that different that merits a difference in ethical treatment? So some people say it's like, well, because humans are more rational, and because we're more rational, then we deserve to be treated as superior. But I find that like a very a very unsavory and unappealing way to answer the question, because it's not true that we're always rational. Like when I was a child, I was not rational, and when I get really old, I'm not going to be rational either. So does that mean that as a child and as like a really old person that I matter less? If anything, you might say that I matter more. Like we should be more concerned with the people who are less rational, because in some ways they're more vulnerable. Um, and so I don't think that rationality makes much sense, because nobody's really prepared to treat less rational humans as morally inferior. That's just really problematic. You're going into a really dangerous area there. Um, so I don't like that approach. And you could say that like that humans matter more because they can use language, but then there's issues there too, because like animals obviously can use language as well, and sometimes their
To
language might be.
communicate with,
Say again.
to communicate with each other, and in some
Yeah,
occasions human.
yeah, in really, really sophisticated ways, for sure. Um, yeah, and I mean, even if we just take like a very scientific evolutionary perspective, like, you know, there isn't anything. Anytime you try to point at something that humans have, and you're trying to say, hey, humans have this but no other animals have that, you're always gonna be disproven at some point, because, you know, like, if you look at the history of human exceptionalism, people have said things like, oh, humans are different because they can use tools. And now we know that that's not true. Like, you know, crows, for instance, there's a kind of crow that lives on this island in New Caledonia, and they create tools, really complex tools, out of tree branches, and they carry these tools around with them, and they teach their children how to make these tools. So you have a lot of interesting things going on here. Like, they can create tools and use these tools, and like they keep these tools because they know that they're going to need them in the future. And then they're also passing down information from one generation to the next. So, like, not only can they use tools, but they're also kind of rational. Like, that's very, like, you're engaging in very complex problem solving abilities there. Um, so yeah, whenever you try to set the bar really high to try to exclude certain beings from the realm of moral consideration, you run into this danger, which is that, you know, you're going to exclude a lot of humans, first of all, and it's almost impossible to not include some animals as well. You know, because it's always going to be the case that some animals are more, like, cognitively complex than some humans. Like, it's just a fact. Like, you know, animals come in all different shapes and sizes, and they have different abilities, and that's also the case with humans. Like, we're very, very different. So I think it's just safer to say that what makes someone count morally is the fact that they can feel pleasure and pain. And so if you have that capacity, I think that you should be counted when we're making moral decisions. We should, like, take you into account and make sure that we're considering your interests and your desires and your well-being. So that's my opinion.
So I think you want to say that the nervous system and the perception of pain, death, and awareness can be determinative. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, and in theory, yeah, these all these things, you know, we can know definitively. I mean, some things we might be unclear about, but for the most part, we do have a lot of good information on these things. So, like, we know that other animals feel pain. There are certain cases where we're unsure. So, like, fish, there's still a little bit of a debate there. Like, do fish actually feel pain, or do they just respond instinctually to certain sensations without being conscious of these sensations, and regarding these sensations as being negative? There's a little bit of a debate there. It seems like the evidence is pointing in the direction of fish can also feel pain, but we're not 100% sure. So there are some, like, borderline cases. So when it comes to fish, I think that I would personally say that we should just be, like, err on the side of caution, and we should just make sure we don't cause them pain just in case. But yeah, when it comes, then there's other cases, like, for instance, like clam. I think that that's pretty clear that they don't feel pain. But I think my main point was just that, you know, these things can be determined scientifically, and that we do have a lot of information about this already, about, like, which animals feel pain and which animals don't feel pain. And I was mentioning that there are some cases where we're not entirely sure just yet, like fish.
Like fishes?
Like fish, yeah. And then but it seems that in that case, it seems like the evidence is pointing in the direction of they probably do feel pain. But yeah, the short answer is that we have a lot of information about these things, and for, you know, most animals, we know definitively that they feel pain, because, like, the mental processes and, like, the way their brains are structured is just very similar to us.
So, now I want to ask about taking advantage of animals. Is the good zoo the closed one? And do you think is the nature of the zoo fundamentally wrong?
I think so. Yeah, because, you know, like, I mean, just think of, like, everything that you're depriving them of. You know, you're depriving them of the ability to, like, there's just so many violations of their own autonomy. You know, so first of all, these animals are taken out from the wild, so they're taken from their homes, they're removed from their, you know, their social context. They might have like these really, in the case of elephants, for instance, like they have really, really complex social relationships, and so you're taking them away from that, from their friends and family, and you're putting them in this environment that's so restricted, and you're taking away so many freedoms, the freedom to roam, because elephants, for instance, roam, you know, like their migration patterns are insane. Like they travel so far, they're constantly traveling. And that's something that just comes naturally to them, and that's part of their life. So you're taking that away from them. You're taking away from them the ability to associate with it, with whomever they feel like associating. So there's just so much that they're being deprived of, and then yeah, it's done purely for our own amusement. And so I think there's something really, really problematic about that. You know, that we're privileging our own amusement. It's not necessary for us to survive. We don't have to go to zoos. This is just because we just like the idea of having animals in cages so that we can see them. So we're privileging this like amusement that we get over like their ability to self govern and to self determine and to live the kind of lives that they were meant to live and the lives that they would want to live. So I think that I'm very much against zoos, and especially now when we have so many other ways to learn about animals. You know, like the amount of documentary films that are coming out, the amount of like research that scientists are doing that gives us access into their lives, their emotional lives, their social lives. So we know
It was
so much about
exactly
it.
my next question.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and
So, what do you think about the? Sorry for interrupting you. You were.
no, 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 go, go.
So, I was saying. So, what about the experiments and the tests that we do on animals? Are we morally permissible?
I I think that's a little bit um less clear cut than zoos. I think zoos is just obviously like this is not okay. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult when we're thinking about animals used for experiments, because you could make the case that, you know, you could make an argument like, you know, if we experiment on these 10 animals or something, we're gonna come to a cure to this disease that's, you know, it's of millions of humans. So you could make a claim like that. But I still wouldn't buy it. I still wouldn't agree. Um, so one thing about research that's done nowadays, because I've to give a little bit of background, I've actually done a little bit of activism in my own life, and a lot of this activism has been directed at animals used in experiments. So um, in a lot of the different universities that I've been at, I've had campaigns against their laboratories that were conducting what I thought were really unethical experiments for like no good reason. And one of the things that I found is that, from my own experience, is that a lot of the research that's conducted on animals, the way that it's justified isn't, you know, it's like, okay, we know for a fact that we can solve this one problem by testing on this many animals. And so in order to like prevent all this human suffering, we're going to test on these animals as a necessary evil. That's not really how it works. Animal research is very sort of and systematized. Are you cutting? Or am I cutting out again?
So,
Hello.
you're back.
Hi.
You're back.
Hey. Hey. Good. Cool. I'm sorry. I'm at a friend's house, and I think everybody else in this house is using the internet at the same time. So I think that
So
maybe
that's
that.
what,
Yeah.
so
I'm sorry.
that's totally okay. So, now, my last question. So, what's your acceptable theory of morality? And how much do the answers depend on everyone's acceptable theory of morality?
So as I mentioned before, I tend to side with Aristotle on a lot of things. And so again, Aristotle's someone who thinks that a person's character is what's important. And so what the right thing to do is whatever like the good person would do in that situation. And so we appeal to the person's character and to the person's like traits. And so when it comes to the issue of like considering what our obligations are to animals, I think that the traits that are relevant are things like being compassionate, being just, so displaying justice in your actions, um, and being caring, things like that. I think those are really important traits to display. And so the benefit of a virtue ethics approach is that you are very sensitive to context. So there are a virtue ethicist wouldn't say that there's like certain rules that you always have to follow no matter what. And so I would disagree with that kind of approach. I think that like we have to look at the situation and like take account of what makes this situation unique, and then based on that information we make a decision. um, and so that's how I approach the issue. But but like a lot of the conclusions that I come to in respect to animals are conclusions that you can get to no matter what ethical theory you subscribe to. So I think that regardless of whether you are a virtue ethicist, or regardless of whether you're someone who starts with a rights-based approach, or who's a consequentialist who thinks that what makes an action right are the consequences and whether these consequences are good or not, I think that you should still think that animals matter morally, because it's just it's it's hard to deny that and not run into a whole bunch of contradictions that most people would want to avoid. So like I mentioned before, it's like if you try to exclude all animals, you're going to end up excluding some humans as well, out of just consistency. So if you say it's like, well, animals don't matter because they're not rational, it's like, well, humans are not rational, for some parts of their life, and some humans aren't, rational to the extent that that we think that normal humans are. So I think that like people should care about animals regardless of what their ethical commitments are. Um, and yeah, I mean, most of the conclusions that I've come to, I think you can come to independently, like depend with whatever theory you subscribe to.
So, um, first of all, I wanna thank you for accepting 3danet's invitation. I've personally learned many things from you. And also, these sessions can be continued. I write my email address in caption to send me the probable questions. I will read them all eagerly and ask them in our next live. So, Kristian, if you want to say anything to the audiences.
Well, first of all, I'm very, very grateful that I was invited to this. I had a lot of fun and I very much enjoyed it. Very grateful. So thank you.
That's
And yeah. And then I welcome if anybody has any questions for me, I welcome you to email me, and I can give you, Sarah, I can give you my email and you can share it with anyone.
Thank you.
But this is a topic that's like I'm very passionate about, so like I'm more than willing to have a conversation with you about it. And again, thank you for inviting me.
So I wish a great day for you, and just thanks for sharing your experiences with us.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.